Long before humans reshaped continents and erased giants from the land, South America belonged to creatures of impossible scale. Among them stood Megatherium, a terrestrial colossus whose presence defied modern expectations of what a sloth could be. This was not a tree-dwelling, slow-moving animal suspended lazily from branches. This was a ground-dominating giant, heavier than most modern elephants, moving deliberately across open landscapes with the confidence of an apex survivor. Megatherium emerged from an ancient lineage of sloths that diverged long before the rise of familiar Ice Age mammals. Its ancestors were smaller, more flexible, adapted to a world of dense vegetation and stable climates. But as environments shifted and resources spread across open plains, natural selection favored size, strength, and endurance. Over time, Megatherium became a monument to evolutionary escalation. When standing upright, Megatherium could reach heights that rivaled giraffes. Its massive pelvis and reinforced spine allowed it to balance on its hind legs and tail, forming a natural tripod. This posture was not accidental. It enabled Megatherium to reach high vegetation, pull down branches, and dominate food sources unavailable to smaller herbivores. In a world of competition, height meant access, and access meant survival. Its forelimbs were its most striking feature. Enormous, curved claws extended from powerful arms, capable of tearing through dense foliage, stripping bark from trees, and possibly defending against predators. These claws were not delicate tools. They were structural weapons, thick, heavy, and driven by muscle mass that rivaled the strongest mammals ever to walk the land. Despite its intimidating form, Megatherium was not a reckless brute. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and efficient. Energy conservation was critical for an animal of such size. Its metabolism favored endurance over speed, allowing it to sustain itself on large quantities of plant matter while minimizing unnecessary exertion. This balance made Megatherium an ecological stabilizer, not a disruptor. The landscapes Megatherium inhabited were diverse. Open grasslands, savannas, forest edges, and river valleys all formed part of its range. As it moved, it reshaped its environment. Trees stripped of leaves, vegetation flattened beneath its weight, pathways carved into the land by repeated movement. Like all megafauna, Megatherium was not just an inhabitant of its ecosystem, it was an architect. Its diet reflected this role. Megatherium consumed tough, fibrous plants, leaves, branches, and possibly roots. Specialized teeth and a powerful jaw allowed it to process vegetation that would have been inedible to smaller herbivores. In doing so, it controlled plant growth patterns, prevented forest overgrowth, and maintained open habitats that supported countless other species. For millions of years, this system worked. Megatherium grew, reproduced, migrated, and endured. It faced predators, but few could challenge it directly. Its size alone acted as deterrent. Even the largest carnivores approached with caution, aware that a single swing of those massive claws could be fatal. But dominance, as history repeatedly shows, is never permanent. Subtle changes began to ripple through Megatherium's world. Climate patterns shifted, vegetation zones moved, and into this already changing landscape stepped a new variable: humans. At first, humans were insignificant. Small, fragile, and outnumbered, they posed little immediate threat to a creature like Megatherium. But they carried something no predator before them had: coordination, tools, and memory shared across generations. The balance that had held for millennia was beginning to tilt. Megatherium did not know it yet, but the Age of Giants was already entering its final chapter. As Megatherium spread across South America, it did so not as a conqueror, but as a constant. Its presence was steady, predictable, and deeply integrated into the rhythm of the land. Seasons changed, rivers shifted, forests expanded and retreated, but Megatherium remained. This consistency shaped not only the landscape, but the behavior of every other species that shared its world. Despite its massive size, Megatherium was not aggressive by default. It did not hunt. It did not chase. Its dominance was passive, enforced by scale rather than conflict. Most predators learned quickly that Megatherium was not worth the risk. A fully grown individual, standing upright, claws extended, presented a wall of muscle and bone that few carnivores could penetrate. Even approaching from behind was dangerous. The tail, thick and muscular, could be used as a stabilizing weapon, turning the entire body into a defensive structure. This defensive posture hints at something critical about Megatherium's behavior. It was aware. Not fast, not reactive, but conscious of space, threat, and balance. It relied on early detection and intimidation rather than escape. Its senses were tuned not for speed, but for anticipation. In open environments, this was enough. Socially, Megatherium remained something of a mystery. Fossil evidence suggests it was largely solitary or loosely associated rather than living in tightly bonded herds. This makes sense for an animal whose size reduced predation risk and whose food sources were widespread rather than concentrated. Cooperation was unnecessary. Independence was efficient. Reproduction followed the same slow rhythm. Megatherium invested heavily in each offspring. Gestation was long, growth slow. Juveniles required extended protection and access to abundant food. This strategy worked in stable environments, but it carried an inherent risk. Population recovery was painfully slow after losses. Megatherium traded resilience for longevity. The arrival of humans disrupted this balance in subtle ways before it became overt. Early humans did not immediately hunt Megatherium into decline. Instead, they altered landscapes. Fire reshaped vegetation. Migration patterns shifted. Competition for resources increased. Humans occupied river valleys and open plains, exactly the environments Megatherium favored. At first, encounters were rare. A giant sloth looming on the horizon was as much a threat to humans as humans were to it. But over time, fear turned into familiarity, and familiarity into strategy. Humans learned Megatherium's habits, its feeding grounds, its predictable movements. Knowledge accumulated quietly. When direct conflict occurred, it was not impulsive. A Megatherium could not be rushed. Humans relied on numbers, endurance, and terrain. They exploited weaknesses not in strength, but in speed and reproduction. Every successful kill removed decades of growth from the population. Every lost juvenile was a future that could not be replaced quickly. At the same time, the environment continued to shift. The Ice Age was unstable, oscillating between cold and warmer periods. Vegetation zones moved faster than Megatherium could adapt. The plants it depended on became less dominant, replaced by species less suited to its feeding style. Energy intake dropped. Stress increased. Megatherium was still powerful, still massive, still capable of defending itself. But its world was narrowing. What had once been endless space became fragmented habitat. What had once been abundant became seasonal. And what had once been stable began to feel unfamiliar. This is how extinction often begins, not with collapse, but with compression. Options shrink, margins disappear, survival becomes less about strength and more about circumstance. Megatherium, the silent giant, continued to walk the land as it always had. But the land was no longer walking with it. As the late Ice Age progressed, the pressures surrounding Megatherium began to converge. Alone, none of them would have been fatal. Together, they formed a trap from which even a giant could not escape. Climate instability, ecological transformation, and sustained human presence did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe. They arrived as permanence, and permanence is what breaks megafauna. Temperature shifts altered rainfall patterns across South America. Grasslands expanded in some regions while forests retreated in others. In many places, plant communities reorganized entirely. The vegetation Megatherium relied upon, tough, fibrous, slow-growing plants, became less dominant. Faster-growing species with lower nutritional value took their place. For an animal that needed enormous daily intake just to maintain its body, this change was devastating. Megatherium could not simply switch diets overnight. Its teeth, jaw mechanics, and digestive system were specialized. Evolution had locked it into a particular ecological role, one that no longer existed everywhere it once did. Feeding took longer, energy returns diminished, fat reserves thinned, stress became chronic rather than seasonal. At the same time, humans refined their impact. By now, Megatherium was no longer an unknown giant on the horizon. It was a resource. Meat, hide, bone, and fat made it invaluable. Hunting strategies did not rely on strength, but on patience and inevitability. Humans exploited terrain, funneled Megatherium into vulnerable positions, and waited. A single kill justified enormous effort. Crucially, humans did not need to hunt many. Megatherium populations were never dense. Removing even a small number of breeding adults destabilized entire regions. The species could not rebound. Its reproductive strategy, slow, careful, long-term, collapsed under short-term losses. The psychological pressure mattered too. Constant disturbance altered behavior. Megatherium avoided previously reliable feeding grounds. Migration patterns shortened or broke entirely. Calves faced increased mortality as adults struggled to meet nutritional demands. Stress hormones, though invisible in the fossil record, left signatures in bone growth and development. Predators that once avoided Megatherium began to test it more frequently. Not because Megatherium had grown weaker, but because opportunity increased. Exhausted animals made mistakes. Injuries accumulated. Healing slowed. The margin between survival and failure narrowed until it vanished. Fossil evidence reflects this decline with haunting clarity. Megatherium remains become rarer and more fragmented. Geographic distribution contracts. What was once a dominant presence across much of a continent becomes isolated pockets, then isolated individuals. The silence spreads unevenly, but it spreads. This was not extinction as spectacle. There were no last stands witnessed, no dramatic collapses recorded. Megatherium did not vanish in a single moment. It faded, generation by generation, as the conditions that sustained it dissolved. What makes this loss particularly striking is how avoidable it might have been under different circumstances. Megatherium was not poorly adapted. It was exquisitely adapted to a world that no longer existed. Evolution had prepared it perfectly for stability, not acceleration. In this sense, Megatherium's fall mirrors a recurring pattern in Earth's history. Giants rise when environments are consistent. They fall when change becomes relentless. Size magnifies success, but it also magnifies vulnerability. By the end of its timeline, Megatherium was no longer shaping the land. The land was shaping it out of existence. The story of Megatherium does not end with bones in the ground. It ends with a question. What happens when a world built for giants collides with a species that does not rely on size, strength, or claws, but on coordination, tools, and intent? This is the final chapter of the giant ground sloth. Not just how it lived, not just how it died, but what its disappearance tells us about ourselves. The first encounter. When early humans entered the landscapes of South America, they did not step into an empty wilderness. They walked into a world dominated by megafauna, creatures so large and powerful that fear was not optional. Megatherium was one of the most imposing. Standing upright, it towered over humans. Its claws were longer than daggers. Its mass alone could decide any physical confrontation. At first glance, it seemed untouchable. But humans did not see a monster. They saw opportunity. Not immediately, not recklessly, but slowly, methodically. The earliest encounters were likely cautious. Humans would have observed from a distance, learning patterns, movement, feeding behavior. They noticed that Megatherium was not aggressive by nature. It did not chase. It did not hunt. It relied on size as its primary defense. And humans learned something critical. Megatherium did not fear them. That was its greatest weakness. The strategy of the small. Humans did not defeat Megatherium through strength. They defeated it through time. They waited. They followed. They tracked. A single human stood no chance. Even a small group would hesitate. But humans hunted in numbers, and more importantly, they communicated. They learned when Megatherium fed. They learned where it rested. They learned how slowly it moved when injured or exhausted. Stone tools left marks on fossilized bones. Cut marks near joints. Evidence of organized butchery. Proof that these were not scavenging events, but planned hunts. Megatherium could kill a predator with one strike. But it could not defend itself from persistence. Wounds that would heal in a wild confrontation became fatal when followed for days. Blood trails told stories. Fatigue did the rest. The giant fell not in a single moment, but across many generations. A world changing faster than evolution. At the same time humans were spreading, the climate was shifting. The ice age was ending. Temperatures rose. Glaciers retreated. Ecosystems transformed. Forests changed composition. Grasslands expanded in some regions and vanished in others. Megatherium was specialized. Its body was built for a specific world, abundant vegetation, stable seasonal patterns, vast, open territories. As environments fragmented, Megatherium had fewer safe places to roam. Food sources changed. Migration routes disappeared. Evolution works slowly. Climate does not. And humans accelerated everything. The final generations. The last Megatherium did not live in a world of abundance. It lived in a shrinking territory, surrounded by unfamiliar threats. Predators it could handle, humans it could not understand. Its instincts had no answer for coordinated attacks. No defense against fire. No fear of creatures that approached without claws or teeth. Generation by generation, their numbers fell. No dramatic extinction event. No sudden apocalypse. Just silence. The last footsteps faded. The forests forgot the weight. And a lineage millions of years old ended without ceremony. The empty niche. When Megatherium disappeared, something profound happened. An entire ecological role vanished. Megatherium shaped landscapes. By pulling down trees, breaking branches, and clearing vegetation, it influenced plant growth patterns. It redistributed nutrients. It created open spaces in dense forests. After its extinction, forest structures changed. Certain plants declined. Others spread uncontrollably. Nature adjusted, but it was not the same system. Megatherium was not replaceable. If Megatherium existed today, imagine a world where Megatherium survived. Protected reserves. Entire ecosystems built around its presence. Scientists tracking a living giant that rewrote our understanding of mammals. It would be the most studied land animal on Earth. But it would also be the most endangered. Because modern humans still struggle with the same challenge, sharing space with something larger than themselves. What Megatherium teaches us. Megatherium's extinction is not just a prehistoric tragedy. It is a warning. Size does not guarantee survival. Strength does not ensure dominance. Adaptation is everything. Humans did not conquer the planet because they were the strongest species, but because they were the most flexible. And that same trait now threatens the world they dominate. Megatherium did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the rules changed. The final image. Picture it. A vast prehistoric plain. The wind moves through tall grass. A single Megatherium stands upright, silhouetted against the fading light. It is not roaring. It is not attacking. It is simply existing. For the last time. Closing reflection. When we uncover Megatherium's bones, we are not just looking at an extinct animal. We are looking at a mirror. A reminder of what happens when intelligence outpaces responsibility. The age of giants is over. But the question remains, what kind of world will remember us?